In April 1951, President Harry S. Truman made one of the most consequential decisions in American history. He fired General Douglas MacArthur, the most famous and celebrated military commander in the country, a man who had led Allied forces to victory in the Pacific during World War II, a general who seemed larger than life itself. The firing sparked a constitutional crisis, ignited a political firestorm, and brought the United States to the brink of a much larger war. At the heart of the controversy was MacArthur's desire to use nuclear weapons against China, to expand the Korean War beyond Korea's borders, and his repeated defiance of presidential authority. This is the story of how America's most celebrated general wanted to nuke China, why he believed it was necessary, and why the President of the United States had no choice but to remove him from command. To understand what happened in 1951, you have to understand Douglas MacArthur. He was not just another general. He was an American icon, a military genius in the eyes of many, and a man with an ego that matched his considerable talents. MacArthur had graduated first in his class at West Point in 1903. He had served with distinction in World War I, rising to command a division at age 38. Between the wars, he had served as superintendent of West Point and as Army Chief of Staff. In the 1930s, he had been sent to the Philippines to organize their defense, and he had stayed there, becoming a field marshal in the Philippine Army in addition to his U.S. rank. When World War II began, MacArthur was in the Philippines when the Japanese attacked. He had been caught unprepared, his air force destroyed on the ground hours after Pearl Harbor despite having warning that war had begun. The Philippines fell to the Japanese, but MacArthur escaped, ordered out by President Roosevelt. He left behind thousands of American and Filipino troops who would endure the Bataan Death March and years of brutal captivity. MacArthur made his famous promise, "I shall return," and he spent the next 3 years fighting his way back across the Pacific. MacArthur's campaign in the Pacific was brilliant in many ways. He used island-hopping tactics, bypassing Japanese strongholds and cutting them off from supply, letting them wither on the vine. He minimized American casualties relative to the gains made. He returned to the Philippines in 1944, fulfilling his promise. And after the atomic bombs and Japan's surrender, he became the supreme commander for the Allied powers in Japan, effectively ruling Japan as it rebuilt and reformed. This is important to understand. From 1945 to 1950, MacArthur ruled Japan with almost absolute authority. He reported to Washington, but he was half a world away, and in practical terms, he made decisions and Washington approved them. He presided over the transformation of Japan from a militaristic empire to a democratic nation. He was worshipped by many Japanese who saw him as a benevolent dictator who had saved them from starvation and chaos after the war. In Tokyo, MacArthur lived in the American embassy, held court like a king, and rarely left Japan. He had not been back to the United States since before the war. By 1950, MacArthur was 70 years old. He was at the peak of his fame and power. He saw himself as not just a military commander, but as a statesman, a figure of historical importance who understood Asia better than anyone in Washington. And here is the critical point. MacArthur believed he was right about everything. He did not just have confidence. He had an unshakable certainty that his judgments were correct, and that anyone who disagreed with him was wrong, stupid, or motivated by politics rather than military necessity. This personality, this absolute self-assurance, would lead directly to the confrontation with Truman. But in June 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea, MacArthur's reputation was at its height. Truman and his advisors turned to MacArthur to save South Korea. He was given command of all United Nations forces in Korea, operating from his headquarters in Tokyo. MacArthur's early performance in Korea justified his reputation. He oversaw the desperate defense of the Pusan perimeter in the summer of 1950. Then in September, He launched the Incheon landing, one of the most brilliant amphibious operations in military history. The landing cut North Korean supply lines, collapsed the North Korean offensive, and turned the tide of the war. By October, UN forces were racing north toward the Chinese border. The war seemed won. It was at this point that the seeds of disaster were planted. As UN forces pushed north toward the Yalu River, which formed the border between North Korea and China, warnings came from Beijing. The Chinese government, through intermediaries, made it clear that if UN forces approached the Chinese border, China would intervene. MacArthur dismissed these warnings. He believed the Chinese were bluffing. He told Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the Chinese would not dare to intervene, and that even if they did, American air power would slaughter them. Truman was worried enough that he flew to Wake Island in October 1950 to meet with MacArthur face to face. It was the only time the two men would meet during Truman's presidency. At Wake Island, Truman asked MacArthur directly about the possibility of Chinese or Soviet intervention. MacArthur assured the president that the war was won, that neither China nor the Soviet Union would intervene, and that American forces would be home by Christmas. Truman, reassured by MacArthur's confidence and by his legendary reputation, approved the advance to the Yalu River. MacArthur was catastrophically wrong. In late October and early November, Chinese forces began crossing the Yalu River in massive numbers. They moved at night, hid during the day, and achieved complete surprise. By late November, over 300,000 Chinese troops were in North Korea. On November 25, they launched a massive offensive that shattered the UN advance. American and South Korean forces were suddenly fighting for survival. The disaster at the Chosin Reservoir and the general retreat from North Korea in the winter of 1950 to 1951 shocked America. The war that had seemed won was now a desperate struggle. UN forces retreated south, giving up all the territory gained in the fall. Seoul, the South Korean capital, fell to communist forces for the second time in the war. By January 1951, the situation had stabilized somewhat. UN forces held a line roughly along the 38th parallel, where the war had started. But the optimism of October was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a grinding war against China. MacArthur's response to this disaster was not to accept responsibility for the intelligence failure or for ignoring Chinese warnings. Instead, he blamed Washington. He argued that he had been fighting with one hand tied behind his back, that political restrictions had prevented him from taking the actions necessary to win the war. And he began to advocate loudly for expanding the war, for taking measures that would, in his view, bring victory. What did MacArthur want to do? His proposals evolved over the months, but they included several key elements. First, he wanted to bomb Chinese territory. UN forces in Korea were prohibited from attacking targets inside China. Chinese aircraft could take off from airfields in Manchuria, attack UN forces, and return to their bases in China without fear of retaliation because those bases were off-limits. Supply depots, railroads, bridges, all the infrastructure supporting the Chinese war effort in Korea was located in China and was untouchable. MacArthur found this intolerable. He wanted permission to bomb Chinese bases, supply lines, and industrial targets. Second, MacArthur wanted to blockade the Chinese coast. He proposed using the US Navy to blockade China's ports, cutting off supplies and strangling Chinese industry. This would be an act of war against China, expanding the conflict from a limited war in Korea to a full-scale war between the United States and China. Third, and most controversially, MacArthur wanted to use Chinese nationalist forces from Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist government had been defeated by the communists in the Chinese Civil War and had fled to Taiwan. MacArthur proposed using these nationalist troops, perhaps 500,000 of them, to invade mainland China, opening a second front. This would embroil the United States directly in the Chinese Civil War. And fourth, MacArthur wanted to use nuclear weapons. He proposed using atomic bombs to destroy Chinese supply lines, to create a radioactive barrier along the Yalu River that would prevent Chinese reinforcement of their forces in Korea, and to strike military targets inside China. He believed that the use of nuclear weapons would be a war-winning move that would force China to withdraw from Korea and possibly even lead to the collapse of the communist government in Beijing. MacArthur's nuclear proposal was not a casual suggestion. He had thought it through, at least from a military perspective. He wanted to drop between 30 and 50 atomic bombs on Chinese and North Korean targets. Some would be used against Chinese troop concentrations in North Korea. Others would be used to destroy the bridges over the Yalu River, cutting the supply lines from China into Korea. And he proposed using atomic bombs to create a belt of radioactive cobalt along the Yalu River, a zone so contaminated that no troops could cross it for years. This atomic barrier would seal off North Korea from Chinese reinforcement. Additionally, MacArthur suggested that atomic bombs could be used against Chinese cities and industrial centers. He believed that a few well-placed nuclear strikes would demonstrate American resolve and force China to negotiate. The shock and awe of nuclear weapons, he argued, would end the war quickly and save lives in the long run by avoiding years of grinding conventional warfare. To MacArthur, these proposals made perfect military sense. He was fighting a war, and in war, you use the weapons available to you to defeat the enemy. America had nuclear weapons. China did not. Why not use that advantage? He saw the restrictions placed on him by Washington as political interference that prevented him from winning. In his view, politicians who did not understand military affairs were tying his hands and prolonging the war unnecessarily. But Truman and his advisors saw the situation very differently. To understand their perspective, you need to understand the world situation in 1951. World War II had ended only 6 years earlier. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, earlier than American intelligence had predicted. The nuclear arms race was underway. Europe was divided between NATO and the Soviet bloc. The Cold War was at its height. American strategy was based on containment of communism, not rolling it back through military force. Truman and his advisors, particularly Secretary of State Dean Acheson and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, believed that the real threat was the Soviet Union, not China. Korea was seen as a limited war, a local conflict that should not be allowed to expand into World War III. If the United States bombed China, if it used nuclear weapons against a communist nation, the Soviet Union might feel compelled to respond. The Soviet Union had a mutual defense treaty with China. Soviet intervention could mean nuclear war, not in Korea but in Europe, where the stakes were far higher. The use of nuclear weapons was not just a military question. It was a moral and political question with enormous ramifications. The United States was the only nation to have used nuclear weapons in war against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Those bombings had killed hundreds of thousands of people, most of them civilians. The moral weight of that decision still hung over America. Using nuclear weapons again, particularly against a nation that did not possess them, would have profound effects on world opinion. American allies in Europe were already nervous about the possibility of nuclear war. Britain, France, and other NATO allies were terrified that a war in Asia might escalate into a war in Europe. They pleaded with Washington not to expand the war, not to use nuclear weapons. There was also the question of what using nuclear weapons would accomplish. Would dropping atomic bombs on Chinese cities really force China to withdraw from Korea? Or would it harden Chinese resolve, turn the war into a nationalistic crusade, and make peace impossible? Would it bring the Soviet Union into the war? Would it destroy the alliance that America had built with its NATO partners? These were not questions with clear answers, but they were questions that Truman had to consider. Truman himself was skeptical of nuclear weapons as a solution to the Korean problem. He had made the decision to use atomic bombs against Japan, and he carried the weight of that decision. He understood what nuclear weapons meant, the destruction they caused, the lives they took. He was not eager to use them again unless absolutely necessary for the survival of the nation. And in his judgment, Korea did not represent that kind of existential threat. The Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed with Truman. They did not support MacArthur's proposals. They believed that expanding the war to China would be a strategic mistake, that it would tie down American forces in Asia while leaving Europe vulnerable. The Army Chief of Staff, General Omar Bradley, who had commanded forces in Europe during World War II, later testified that MacArthur's proposed war with China would be the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. This became one of the most famous quotes from the entire controversy. So Truman said no. He refused to authorize bombing of Chinese territory beyond the immediate border area. He refused to authorize a naval blockade of China. He refused to allow the use of Chinese nationalist forces, and he absolutely refused to authorize the use of nuclear weapons. The war in Korea would remain limited. The goal would not be to conquer North Korea or to destroy China, but to restore the status quo, to push communist forces back to the 38th parallel and negotiate an armistice. MacArthur could not accept this. He believed Truman was wrong, that the restrictions were allowing China to fight a war without consequences, that American soldiers were dying because politicians lacked the courage to do what was necessary to win. And here is where MacArthur made his fatal mistake. He began to publicly criticize the president's policies. He began to go around the chain of command, to make statements to the press, to communicate with members of Congress, all in an attempt to change policy or to force Truman's hand. In December 1950, Truman issued an order requiring all military commanders to clear any statements on policy with Washington before making them public. This was a direct response to MacArthur's tendency to speak out publicly on political matters. Truman wanted to ensure that the military spoke with one voice, the voice of the president as commander-in-chief. MacArthur agreed to follow the order, but he did not really change his behavior. In March 1951, as UN forces pushed back north and stabilized the front lines, Truman prepared to make a peace offer. He was ready to propose negotiations with China and North Korea, seeking an armistice that would end the fighting. But before Truman could make his announcement, MacArthur issued his own statement. He essentially threatened China, saying that if they did not negotiate on his terms, he would expand the war. He made it sound like the United States was on the verge of attacking China proper, exactly the opposite of what Truman wanted to communicate. MacArthur's statement destroyed Truman's peace initiative. China refused to negotiate, seeing MacArthur's threat as evidence of American bad faith. Truman was furious. MacArthur had sabotaged the president's diplomatic efforts, had undercut American foreign policy, and had done so deliberately. But Truman still hesitated to fire MacArthur. The general was enormously popular. He was a war hero. Firing him would cause a political explosion. Then came the final straw. On April 5, 1951, Congressman Joseph Martin, a Republican and the House Minority Leader, read a letter from MacArthur on the floor of the House of Representatives. Martin had written to MacArthur, asking for his views on using Chinese nationalist forces in Korea. MacArthur's reply was a political bombshell. He wrote that he agreed with Martin's position, that there was no substitute for victory, that the decision to limit the war was wrong, and that if America lost in Asia, Europe would fall to communism anyway. This was open insubordination. MacArthur was not just disagreeing with policy privately or even publicly. He was actively working with opposition politicians to undermine the president's policy. He was trying to use his popularity and prestige to force a change in national strategy, going over the president's head to Congress and the public. This was a fundamental challenge to civilian control of the military, a principle enshrined in the Constitution. Truman consulted with his top advisors. Secretary of State Aikson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff all agreed that MacArthur had to go. He had violated direct orders, had undermined American foreign policy, had sabotaged peace negotiations, and had challenged the president's authority as commander-in-chief. There was no choice. MacArthur had to be relieved of command. On April 11, 1951, Truman announced that he was relieving General Douglas MacArthur of all his commands. MacArthur was stripped of his position as Supreme Commander Allied Powers in Japan, as Commander of UN Forces in Korea, and as Commander of US Forces in the Far East. He was being recalled to the United States. General Matthew Ridgway, who had commanded the 8th Army in Korea and had successfully stabilized the front after the Chinese intervention, would replace MacArthur. The announcement shocked the nation. MacArthur was an American hero, and now he was being fired by a president whose approval ratings were already low. The Republican opposition saw an opportunity to attack Truman. MacArthur's supporters claimed that Truman was soft on communism, that he was preventing the military from winning the war, that he was appeasing China. The backlash was immediate and intense. MacArthur returned to the United States for the first time in over a decade. He received a hero's welcome. Millions lined the streets for parades in his honor. He addressed a joint session of Congress, giving a speech that became famous for its closing line, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." The speech was emotional, powerful, and highly political. MacArthur defended his positions, criticized the limitations placed on him, and portrayed himself as a soldier who had been betrayed by politicians. The speech was a masterpiece of rhetoric, but it was also deeply misleading. MacArthur presented the Korean War as a simple matter of military tactics, as if the only question was how to win the war in Korea. He ignored the larger strategic context, the danger of Soviet intervention, the concerns of American allies, the risk of nuclear war. He portrayed himself as a soldier who wanted only to serve his country and win the war, when in fact he had repeatedly defied orders, undermined presidential policy, and challenged civilian authority. Congress held hearings on MacArthur's dismissal and on Korean war policy. The hearings lasted for weeks and heard testimony from MacArthur, from Truman's advisors, and from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The hearings were televised and became a national spectacle. MacArthur testified for 3 days, laying out his case for expanding the war, using nuclear weapons, and attacking China. He was eloquent, passionate, and utterly convinced of his own correctness. But as the hearings continued, the weaknesses in MacArthur's position became clear. The Joint Chiefs of Staff testified that they did not support MacArthur's proposals, that expanding the war to China would be a mistake. General Omar Bradley delivered his famous line about the wrong war in the wrong place. Secretary of State Aikson explained the diplomatic ramifications, the effect on American allies, the danger of bringing the Soviet Union into the war. Secretary of Defense Marshall, himself a 5-star general and a highly respected figure, supported Truman's decision to fire MacArthur. The testimony revealed that MacArthur had been operating in isolation, convinced of his own genius, but disconnected from the larger strategic reality. He had been wrong about Chinese intervention, confidently predicting they would not enter the war right up until they did. His intelligence had been faulty. His certainty had been misplaced, and his solution, nuclear war with China, was rejected by virtually every other senior military and civilian leader in the government. Public opinion began to shift. The initial outrage at MacArthur's firing faded as people learned more about what had actually happened. MacArthur had defied orders. He had undermined presidential policy. He had tried to force the president's hand by going to Congress and the public. Whatever his military brilliance, he had violated fundamental principles of civilian control of the military. In a democracy, the military does not make policy. The president makes policy and the military executes it. MacArthur had forgotten that, or had decided it did not apply to him. The constitutional principle at stake was crucial. The founders of the United States had been deeply concerned about military power threatening civilian government. They had seen how in other countries generals had overthrown governments or had become dictators. So the Constitution made the president, a civilian elected by the people, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The military was subordinate to civilian authority. This was not just a legal technicality, it was a fundamental safeguard of democracy. MacArthur's actions had threatened that principle. If a general could defy the president, could make policy pronouncements on his own, could lobby Congress to overrule the commander-in-chief, then civilian control would be meaningless. The military would become a political actor, pursuing its own agenda regardless of what elected leaders decided. Truman, by firing MacArthur, was defending the Constitution. He was asserting that in America, generals do not overrule presidents, no matter how popular or brilliant those generals might be. Why did MacArthur want to use nuclear weapons? Part of the answer is that he genuinely believed it would work. He thought that the shock of nuclear attack would force China to withdraw, that the war could be won quickly with atomic bombs. He saw nuclear weapons as just another weapon, more powerful than conventional bombs, but not fundamentally different. He did not seem to grasp the political and moral dimensions of nuclear weapons, or if he did grasp them, he did not care. To MacArthur, winning the war was what mattered, and nuclear weapons were a tool for winning. But there was also MacArthur's ego. He had been certain that China would not intervene, and he had been proven spectacularly wrong. His reputation had suffered. The war he had proclaimed won in October had turned into a disaster in November. His response was not to accept responsibility, but to blame others and to demand that he be given the tools to fix the situation. Nuclear weapons became the solution in his mind because they represented overwhelming power, a way to salvage victory from defeat, to vindicate his judgment. There was also MacArthur's worldview. He believed deeply in American power and in the necessity of defeating communism. He saw the Cold War in stark, simple terms, us versus them, good versus evil, victory or defeat. He believed that showing weakness, accepting a limited war, negotiating with communists, all of this would lead to disaster. Better to use maximum force now to destroy the communist threat while America had the advantage than to wait and fight a larger war later. This was not an uncommon view in 1951. Many Americans shared MacArthur's anti-communist fervor and his belief that America should use its power decisively. But Truman and his advisors had a more nuanced view. They understood that the world was complicated, that American power had limits, that allies mattered, that the Soviet Union was the real threat, not China. They understood that using nuclear weapons would not solve the problem of communism, might well make the Cold War more dangerous, and could lead to a war that would destroy civilization. They were thinking not just about Korea, but about the global balance of power, about the long term, about the kind of world they wanted to create. The debate between Truman and MacArthur was, at its core, a debate about the nature of American power and how it should be used. MacArthur represented the view that American military power should be used to maximum effect, that once committed to a war, America should fight to win decisively, using whatever weapons were necessary. Truman represented the view that military power was a tool of policy, that policy was determined by political leaders considering national interests and international realities, and that sometimes limited objectives were wiser than total victory. This debate did not end with MacArthur's firing. It has continued throughout American history. We saw it in Vietnam, where military commanders wanted to expand the war and use more force, while political leaders tried to keep the war limited. We saw it in debates over the use of force in the Middle East. We see it today in discussions about American military commitments around the world. The tension between military effectiveness and political wisdom, between winning wars and maintaining peace, between decisive force and restraint, these tensions are inherent in the relationship between military and civilian power in a democracy. What would have happened if Truman had approved MacArthur's plan? If the United States had used nuclear weapons against China, bombed Chinese cities and military bases, blockaded Chinese ports, and supported a Chinese nationalist invasion of the mainland? We can never know for certain, but we can make educated guesses based on what we know about the situation. First, the use of nuclear weapons against China would likely have brought the Soviet Union into the war. Stalin had a mutual defense pact with China. If America was nuking China, the Soviets would have been under enormous pressure to respond. This might have meant direct Soviet military intervention in Korea or China. It might have meant Soviet attacks on American forces in Asia. Or it might have meant Soviet action in Europe, perhaps a move against West Berlin or an invasion of West Germany. The risk of World War III would have been very high. Second, American allies in Europe would have been horrified. Britain, France, and other NATO allies were already nervous about American policy in Asia. They feared being dragged into a war with China or the Soviet Union over Korea, which they did not see as vital to their interests. If America used nuclear weapons, it would have strained the NATO alliance, perhaps to the breaking point. European nations might have distanced themselves from the United States, might have refused to support American policy, might even have considered neutrality in the Cold War. The alliance that was America's greatest strategic asset would have been damaged or destroyed. Third, using nuclear weapons against China would have had profound effects on world opinion. The United States would have been seen as a nuclear bully, willing to use weapons of mass destruction against a nation that could not retaliate in kind. The moral authority that America claimed in the Cold War, the idea that America was defending freedom and democracy against totalitarian communism, would have been severely undermined. Asian and African nations that were non-aligned in the Cold War might have turned against America. The Soviet Union would have used American nuclear attacks in its propaganda, portraying America as an aggressive, imperialistic power. Fourth, it is not clear that nuclear weapons would have achieved MacArthur's objectives. China in 1951 was not Japan in 1945. Japan was a densely populated island nation with concentrated cities and industry. Nuclear weapons against Japan's cities had a decisive effect. China was a vast continental nation, mostly rural, with its population spread out. Nuclear strikes against Chinese cities would have killed millions, but would they have forced the Chinese government to surrender? China had just emerged from decades of civil war, foreign invasion, and revolution. The Chinese people had already suffered immensely. Would a few more cities destroyed have broken their will, or would it have hardened resistance, turned the war into a nationalistic crusade, and made peace impossible? Fifth, using nuclear weapons would have set a precedent. It would have established that nuclear weapons were acceptable tools of warfare, to be used not just in existential crises, but in limited wars over peripheral interests. This would have made nuclear war more likely in the future. Every crisis, every conflict, would have carried the possibility of nuclear escalation. The arms race would have intensified. Other nations would have rushed to acquire nuclear weapons for their own protection. The world would have become a much more dangerous place. For all these reasons, Truman's decision not to use nuclear weapons in Korea was wise. It was the decision of a leader who understood that military power must be subordinate to political judgment, that short-term military gains must be weighed against long-term strategic consequences, and that in the nuclear age, restraint was as important as strength. MacArthur never understood this. He never accepted that he had been wrong. He faded from public life over the next decade, living quietly in New York, giving occasional speeches, writing his memoirs. He died in 1964, still convinced that he had been right and that Truman had been wrong, that the war in Korea could have been won if only he had been allowed to use the tools at his disposal. History has largely vindicated Truman. Most historians and military analysts today believe that Truman made the right decision, that MacArthur's proposals would have led to disaster, and that firing MacArthur was necessary to preserve civilian control of the military. The Korean War ended in 1953 with an armistice that left the border roughly where it had been in 1950. This was not the total victory MacArthur had wanted, but it achieved the limited objective of preserving South Korea. And it did so without triggering World War III, without using nuclear weapons, and without destroying America's alliances. The story of MacArthur and Truman is a story about power and its limits. MacArthur had enormous military power, the ability to command armies, to plan campaigns, to win battles. But he did not have political power, the authority to make policy, to decide when and where to use military force, to determine national objectives. He tried to claim that political power anyway, and he was stopped. Truman had political power as president, but he faced enormous pressure from a popular general, from opposition politicians, from a public frustrated by a limited war. He could have given in, could have let MacArthur have his way. But he stood firm, defended constitutional principles, and made the hard choice to fire a war hero. The constitutional crisis of 1951 was resolved in favor of civilian control, but the underlying tensions remain. In any democracy, there will always be tension between military and civilian leaders. Generals will always believe they know how to win wars, and sometimes they will chafe at political restrictions. Politicians will always have to balance military advice against diplomatic, economic, and moral considerations. The challenge is to maintain a healthy civil-military relationship where military leaders provide honest advice and vigorous advocacy for their positions, but where they also accept that final decisions belong to elected civilian leaders. MacArthur failed that test. He could not accept that the president had the authority to overrule him. He could not accept that his military judgment might be wrong or might need to be subordinated to larger political considerations. He saw himself as indispensable, as the only man who understood Asia, as a figure above politics who should be free to make the decisions necessary to win. This was not just arrogance, though it was that. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of how democracy works. Truman succeeded in that test. He listened to MacArthur's advice, considered it seriously, consulted with other advisors, and then made a decision. When MacArthur refused to accept that decision and tried to undermine it, Truman removed him. It was politically costly. Truman's approval ratings were already low, and firing MacArthur made them worse. He was vilified by Republicans and by MacArthur's supporters. But he did what the Constitution required and what the situation demanded. The question of whether to use nuclear weapons in Korea was one of the most consequential decisions of the 20th century. If Truman had said yes, if he had authorized MacArthur to use atomic bombs against China, the history of the world would have been radically different. We might have had World War III in 1951. We might have had nuclear exchanges that killed tens of millions. We might have had a world where nuclear weapons were seen as normal tools of warfare. We might have lost the Cold War because we lost our allies and our moral authority. Truman said no, and in saying no, he set a precedent. Nuclear weapons would not be used in limited wars. They would be reserved for existential threats, for the defense of the nation itself. This precedent has held for over 70 years. Since Nagasaki in 1945, no nation has used nuclear weapons in war. There have been many wars, many crises, many opportunities to use nuclear weapons, but they have not been used. Part of the reason is the precedent Truman set in 1951 when he refused MacArthur's demands. The story of MacArthur wanting to nuke China and Truman firing him for it is not just a historical curiosity. It is a story about fundamental questions of power, authority, democracy, and the use of force. It is about how nations make decisions about war and peace, about who gets to make those decisions, and about the consequences of those decisions. It is about the danger of military leaders who believe they are above civilian control, and about the courage required of political leaders to stand up to popular military figures. MacArthur was a great general in many ways. His Pacific campaign in World War II was brilliant. His occupation of Japan was generally successful, but in Korea he failed. He failed as a strategist, misjudging Chinese intentions and capabilities. He failed as a subordinate, defying orders and undermining policy. And he failed as an American, forgetting that in a democracy, the military serves the people through their elected representatives, not the other way around. Truman was not a great military strategist. He had been an artillery captain in World War I, but had no experience commanding large forces. He was a politician, a product of the Kansas City Democratic machine, a man who had been thrust into the presidency when Roosevelt died and who had spent the previous 6 years dealing with one crisis after another. But in the showdown with MacArthur, Truman proved to be a great president. He understood what was at stake, he made the hard decision, and he accepted the political consequences. The lesson of 1951 is that in a democracy, civilian control of the military is not negotiable. It does not matter how brilliant or popular a general is. It does not matter if that general is right on the military merits of his position. What matters is that the constitutional order is preserved, that elected leaders make policy, and that the military executes that policy. When a general forgets this, when he tries to use his position to make policy or to override civilian leaders, he must be removed. Truman understood this, and he acted accordingly. The United States did not use nuclear weapons in Korea. The war remained limited. It ended in a stalemate that has persisted for over 70 years, with Korea divided at the 38th parallel, with American troops still stationed in South Korea, with the threat of renewed war always present. This is not a satisfying ending. It is not the total victory MacArthur wanted. But it preserved peace, prevented World War III, maintained American alliances, and kept the world from descending into nuclear holocaust. In the nuclear age, sometimes the best you can do is avoid catastrophe. Truman avoided catastrophe, and for that, history should remember him well.